you certainly don't start with many fluffball questions. I will say that for you. First part of the question, not that difficult. Second part, I'm not sure if anyone has a firm answer, but I'll do my level best to start down that path at least. So as far as the volatility, the U.S. had started 5 years ago. COVID reared its ugly head. It became apparent to us just about this time in 2020 that it was big, it was real, it was going to impact our lives. So it was really two issues. We had COVID hitting first, but then we had the acceleration of the administration having legislation in place for decarbonization. And that decarbonization looked like it was going to head toward taking away existing sources of CO2. There's several more factors, so why don't we dive into it just a little bit more. So when COVID hit, driving in the US for the spring of 2020 was down by 50%. Ethanol is 40% of the industry's supply. So you put those two together, and it's obvious supply of CO2 contracted tremendously. Sources were hurt. 5 ethanol plants out of the 28 or so in the country that make CO2 were shut down permanently, many cut back, at least temporarily. So that had a profound impact that lasted several years. As we came out of that, the next impact we had was decarbonization. So there had been 45Q legislation, but the Inflation Reduction Act increased those levels up to $85 a ton for sequestration and $60 per metric ton for EOR and for utilization. So we saw more companies, primarily ethanol companies, interested in thinking that they were going to garner very large amounts for their CO2, much more than they were being paid for that feedstock by the industrial gas industry. So we saw those companies starting to cancel contracts, not extend the existing contracts, trying to keep that CO2 resource available for higher value, be it SAF production or e-fuel type of production. So we saw a further contraction of CO2 due to that. Combine that with just the natural CO2 industry, typically loses 1, 2, or 3 sources a year due to economic factors or the age of the plants being too old to repair. We had that going around. In 2022, we happened to have a purity issue at the Jackson Dome, which is 18% of the CO2 in the country. So that had an impact, at least for 3 or 4 months until it was corrected. And then as soon as that was corrected, we had huge outages at 2 very large ammonia plants on the East Coast at Augusta and Hopewell that actually overlapped for a few weeks. So we had a lot going on. And meanwhile, the industry, there were very few traditional sources available to grow and replace the ones that were lost. We had reached the point where all the good sources had already been tapped a decade or more ago. And the gas companies really were not that focused on CO2. CO2 is less than 5% of their revenues and profits. They had big demand for hydrogen growth. They saw that as the future. That was starting to eat into all the capital availability. So the companies were not keen to take a risk on sources that might be closing when they could build an air separation plant or build a hydrogen plant or something that had a much more sustainable and level revenue, profitability future ahead of it. Fortunately, last year, 2024, was relatively placid. So it was the best year we've seen in 4, and hopefully that trend will continue. To the second part of your question, that's a lot more difficult. What do we do to correct this? Obviously, the answer is build more sources, but the sources that are available today are much more expensive. People want more for their feed gas. Most of the high purity sources are very small, so that drives up the cost. Or we're going to have to capture low purity sources, which drives up the cost even more. The other answer, and the one that was most expedient and most companies went to immediately, is right-sizing demand. If you don't have enough capacity and there's a shortage, price will tend to cure that for you. So I firmly believe the industry took the right measured approach, which was to increase price, help their profitability, maybe put more money in the pot for future expansion, And as a result of that, we saw a decrease in demand, which was part of the reason why we did not have any big issues confronting us in 2024. There were not any turnarounds, unexpected events. Things had normalized with COVID, with driver shortages. And as a result of not having big turnarounds, we were able to get through 2024 relatively unscathed.